Welcome to our Food for Thought session number 4 already. My name is Roy Smith, Manager Technology here in Royal Davis Wiener. And last session we stopped where we had the press cake. So from the cocoa liquor pressing, we got a cocoa butter, and we got a press cake. Now in this session I would like to tell you about cocoa powder processing to make from this cake a cocoa powder. A lot of people will say, well, you have to just cool it. Cocoa powder needs to be stabilized. It's not just cooling, it is about stabilization. So from the cake, we're going to break it into kibbled cake and then pulverize it into cocoa powder. Cake breaking, I have another cake here. So basically what happens, we have the cake. In the industry it goes a bit automatic. Here we have to do it by hand. Now, so you can hear that all the cake, the big cake is now broken into kibbled pieces, which you can see here. Those are the kibbled pieces we can feed to the powder line. So we feed it up here. With cold air, those kibbled cake pieces are transported into the classifier mill. That's where it's pulverized into cocoa powder. By pulverization, you add energy. If you add energy, the temperature goes up. So the fat, which was still in our cake, 10–12%, is at that stage liquid. And this is what we need to stabilize. Again, this is not cooling, it's stabilization. So the cocoa powder is going out. In the cyclone, it's separated. The cocoa powder drops down and the air goes through the filter and it's going to be cooled again. So during the transport to the cyclone, this is where we cool the powder. We cool the powder, then we put it in the cyclone. We leave it in there for 15 minutes. This allows the cocoa butter, which is still in there, this 10–12%, to crystallize. Before we have an uncontrolled crystallization, we transport it to the next stage, again with cold air. And in this step, this is where we take the crystallization heat out and where the right crystals are formed for a stable cocoa powder. Now, why do we want to have a stable cocoa powder? Cocoa powder needs to be stabilized. Well, you can see it in terms of color. Color is an important factor for an incoming check, but the main issue is you don't want to have lumpy cocoa powder with lumps. You want to have a free-flowing cocoa powder. And for this reason, you need to stabilize the fat inside the cocoa powder. If you do not do this in a correct way, during storage and transport, there is a wild crystallization. Crystallization heat is not coming out, and you get a lumpy cocoa powder. And that's not what customers want. So, you can measure this. This crystallization you can measure. You have seen the lab in session number 2. This is where we have a DSC equipment where we can actually really measure the crystallization, but there's also a quick method. If you do not have a lab, if you do not have this expensive equipment, then there is another quick method to know if your stabilization is in the right area, if you have done your stabilization of your cocoa powder in the correct way. And to show you this, I'm here with Dane, my colleague Dane de Hennepe, and he will explain to you about this method. Dane, tell me, what do we have here? I see Thermos flasks, I see temperature sensors. What's going on?
So these Thermos flasks are filled with cocoa powder.
Okay.
And like you explained, when you have recrystallization, heat is released. Yeah. And this heat we can measure. Okay. With this method, we put in cocoa powder and we measure the temperature increase over time.
Okay.
We have a stable cocoa powder if the temperature increase over 1 hour is not more than 2 degrees Celsius. Okay. Because then all the crystallization heat has taken out in the powder line. Okay. And we don't observe it in the Thermos flask.
Okay, so you want to, and that's why you use a Thermos flask, of course.
Because then all the heat which is released is converted into temperature increase.
Into temperature, it's not going to the outside.
Yes.
That sounds really a smart way of doing it. How do you come to this 2 degrees Celsius?
So before we measured with DSC, we've done a lot of studies about the crystallization of the cocoa powder.
Okay.
And based on those measurements and with experience, we've determined that a 2 degrees temperature increase will result in a stable powder.
Okay. So, well, it's impossible to turn on the whole powder line because it's really noisy and dusty. But you did some trials before, and that this is the powder in there is now being measured as
Correct.
we speak.
Yeah. So we have the powder here of different steps during the stabilization process.
Okay.
And I've wrote down here the temperatures and temperatures increase.
Okay. Looks good so far.
So we have indeed here we have the after the first stabilization step, where you see a temperature increase. Also the temperature of the powder is quite warm.
Yeah.
Then after the second stabilization step, the temperature is also increasing.
Okay.
And we have a little bit lower temperature.
Okay.
And after the third stabilization step, we have a low cocoa powder temperature, and also the temperature increase is low, which is indicating we have a stabilized cocoa powder.
Okay, so that's an easy way. Can you show me how it works?
Yes, of course.
So we have a thermos flask, we have cocoa powder.
We fill it up.
So it's important that this cocoa powder comes straight from the line, that you do not put it up there and leave it for half a day and then do this test. The trick of this test is that right after the grinding, you need to fill it up in the thermos flask.
We put in the temperature probe.
Close it up.
Close it properly.
Okay. Start the timer. Okay.
Start the timer, and then we write down the temperature.
Okay, yeah. So basically, what we have here then is after 1 hour, we know if the cocoa powder is well stabilized or not.
Correct. It's a relatively quick method. The other way you could also do it is wait 1 day and evaluate the cocoa powder in your bag.
Yeah.
But then you need to wait 1 day, and this gives a relatively
in
quick
1 hour a solid answer. So what if it's not well stabilized? We know lumps. I see there cocoa powder with color difference. Is this the difference you see normally?
Yeah.
Or?
So we have here two cocoa powders. It's the same cocoa powder, but one is stabilized and the other one is not stabilized. And you can see there's a color difference.
And even better.
Even better when
and
you...
This is what I saw my colleague Dani do as well with the coffee. They do it the same. So the color difference really shows if you flatten it out a little bit. I like this. But again, so whether you're in coffee or in cocoa, this kind of color differences shows you very well the way if it's stabilized or not.
Correct.
So if you did it in a proper way, you know this within an hour, and then you can safely pack your cocoa powder and store and transport it without having lumps or customers complaining that they have a cocoa powder which is lumped.
Correct.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is for our fourth session, and I look forward to welcome you on our next session, the fifth session. Bye bye.